Well, hello there, and welcome to what is the 163rd edition of DF Direct Weekly, our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. And strap in for this one because there's certainly a lot of news to discuss this week. Joining me to go through it all, first of all, Oliver Mackenzie.
Hello. Yes, hi Rich. Today here to talk about Ghost of Tsushima and Assassin's Creed Ghosts of Tsushima.
And he's back from vacation. Hi, John Linneman.
Wait, I was back last week as well.
Oh, of course you were, yes.
But I'm here again. But this one's exciting because today Oliver and I are talking TVs later.
We're talking
in the show
TVs. It's the battle
we
of the
both
TVs.
got new TVs,
Yep.
and it's like opposing technologies. So
absolutely,
it's a good thing to talk about. I think.
Expect fireworks. It's going to get spicy.
It's going to get spicy.
Okay, let's crack on with our first news topic of the week. So, first news topic of the week is the fact that Ghost of Tsushima has, quote-unquote, dropped on PC. It has arrived. I did have concerns about this one because it arrived with no early review code access whatsoever, which isn't typically the thing you want to see with a PC release. It's what you might call a red flag. However, the port has arrived. We've played it, and first impressions looking pretty awesome. Oliver, let's start kind of like super low specs here because you've taken a look at the game running on Steam Deck, right?
Ooh.
Yes, I have. And it actually runs surprisingly well, I think, considering the specs that are laid out for the game. I was a little bit worried because the specs were very similar to what we saw for Horizon Forbidden West, which is not such a great game on the Steam Deck as it turns out. So I was a little bit nervous about this one, but actually you can hit about 800p 30 with medium settings with some dips. But if you turn on FSR3 its quality mode, you can get to a very comfortable, 30 plus FPS, even like 40 FPS in some areas. It runs pretty well with just some cutscenes dipping. So like the opening cutscenes, for whatever reason, some of them run in like the 20s.
They're very heavy.
They're quite heavy, yeah. And like, especially the transitions between cutscenes, you get like a big frame time spike there. But for the most part, it is running at 30, and that's basically in line with what we've seen from the Steam Deck in other PS4 era titles like God of War, for instance, where it is basically delivering a PS4 class experience just at kind of like that 720p, 800p mark, where the GPU load is a little bit less, bandwidth is less of a priority, less of a concern, and the Steam Deck is actually able to kind of hang roughly with where the PS4 is. Now, I haven't compared medium settings on the Steam Deck to the settings in the PS4, but I presume it's probably in that ballpark in terms of settings. And it looks fantastic on the device. It looks really good on the Steam Deck OLED in particular. You get great HDR support too. It looks awesome. So I was really satisfied with that. I mean, I think it's a great PS4 era port for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Let's just go into some of the basics. Alex style. Alex isn't here. He's on holiday today. But we will be doing a more in-depth Tsushima video next week, I guess. But yes, just sort of Alex type comments. It's a Nixis game. It's very solid overall. The menu system is logical, very attractive. It has all of the standard Nixis options. Of a particular note is that you can have a DLSS 3 frame generation, but you can also have FSR 3 frame generation that can accept inputs from DLSS. So you don't need to have FSR upscaling with FSR frame generation. You can mix and match, which I believe is a first. Haven't tested FSR 3, but I think, John, you had a quick look at it on a high-end rig, right?
I did have a go, and yeah, it runs great as you would expect on, a higher end system. But I did have a weird sort of visual issue with DLSS 3 frame generation. In certain sequences, you could see like these little flashing black bars in the image. I'm not sure what was going on there, which prompted me to go, all right, let's try FSR 3 frame generation, which did work without that issue. Although it still exhibits that when you're below the target frame rate or refresh rate, you get a little bit of like juddery look to it versus DLSS frame gen, which works perfectly with VRR. But FSR 3 frame gen combined with DLAA and DLSS, I guess, I tried both. It works. It works well, and you get the image quality benefits of DLSS. With the frame generation features of FSR3, which is neat to see because like you said, I can't remember if this is the first or not, but I don't feel like I've ever tried that combination before.
I don't think I've seen it before, so I do think it's a first, and it kind of rewrites what we know about FSR3 frame gen, which is that it requires the FSR2 inputs, but it looks as though Nixis may have found a way to hotwire the way around that, since those inputs will be very different, very similar rather.
That's super cool, because I'm not a fan of FSR2 or just general FSR upscaling. I think it can look okay at higher enough resolutions, but it's largely inferior to DLSS. I think we can all agree, right?
Yeah.
But their frame gen, aside from that little bit of issue that they still need to work on with the fluidity, the actual quality of the generated frames is quite good. And when sampling from DLSS, I found it difficult just without capturing and looking closely, just playing the game. I felt like what I was getting was comparable to DLSS frame generation, just in terms of general image quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, it makes a pretty strong impression. I was also pleased that the cutscenes are uncapped on PC.
Yes.
So, on a high-end machine, obviously, it's just like with frame gen, you're getting like 120 frames per second easy during those intro scenes, and it just looks fantastic.
Yeah.
Combined with the excellent HDR, which is, again, that's good. HDR makes a very big difference in terms of how it impresses you when playing a game, and Tsushima does a pretty good job with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and like you said, the options menu is well featured, but what I liked is that it retains, there's a viewport on the right-hand side of the screen when you're in the options that shows the in-game graphics of your current scene. And as you make changes, it instantly swaps between, you can see the changes take effect immediately.
Cool. Yeah.
Without any sort of loading or hiccups or anything like that. Even when going through the full preset list, like low, medium, high, very high, you actually see it drastically alter itself as you click through it, which is great. Mm-hmm. Although, as you noted, very high preset is not actually the highest. Yeah. There were a couple other settings you can increase, including shadows, anisotropic filtering, and there's also different types of ambient occlusion available. And it just defaults to, I think, SSAO, like quality, but there's actually two other options, including HBAO Plus and another one I'm forgetting the name of.
Yeah, XCGTAO. I believe,
yeah, one of those. Yeah. So it's full featured. It plays. It actually, I tried playing with the mouse and keyboard, and it actually feels good there.
Wow.
You can increase the FOV, which I can't remember if that was possible on PlayStation. It's been a long time, actually, but it is nice being able to expand that out, because they like to place your character very large on the screen at times, and being able to pull out the view a little bit is great.
Yeah.
So,
so I played
all strong first impressions.
I played it on two separate rigs. First of all, similar to John's, 4090, but I had 13900K. And I just whacked everything up to maximum, because that's kind of what you're paying for with a 4090, isn't it? Just don't care about optimized settings. And initially, I used DLSS 3 frame gen. It's interesting. I didn't have that artifacting problem you had, John.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's up with that.
But yeah, you're basically north of 100 frames per second with DLAA. And I've got to say that the PS5 version in both its modes uses checkerboarding, 1800p and 2160p checkerboard, depending on the mode, and just image quality with DLAA is just off the charts by comparison. It just looks
light
incredible.
years ahead.
So you can see I've got some performance data here. The initial sort of area, which is pretty stressful, I actually think, and certainly in terms of the cutscene, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it just plays out, pretty much north of 100 frames per second with DLSS 3. And if you don't use DLSS 3, which is the majority of my 4090 capture here, you're kind of like, I think the absolute minimum I saw was 72 FPS. That's fully maxed with DLAA. And it just powers through. It looks absolutely terrific. But, 70 FPS on 4090, that does suggest it is quite heavy. But I guess that also points to scalability. But yeah, absolutely phenomenal looking game. I've kind of forgotten how good it looked, but it's kind of weird because it's very much a game of its era. It is fundamentally a PlayStation 4 game, but when you look at the quality of the assets and the style that they've delivered here, it still holds up.
I gotta say, Rich, talking about that game does make me nostalgic for the bygone days of E3, and so because I was there at the Sony's final E3 conference show where they tried something different, where they moved you through different buildings
Yes, I
on
do remember
site.
that. You were baffled at the time by the
I
entire
was so
proceeding.
baffled by it. But after The Last of Us Part 2, they had everybody go through this like long sort of like ornate Japanese style hallway with like a little garden and like water around you. And then you come into this big theater and it's like a ultra wide aspect screen at the front, which they use for sort of cinematic effect, but they had the blowing grass spread across that entire screen with like the sound effects and like the wind blowing around you as you sat down. And I got to sit right in front of Neil Druckmann, honestly, which was unexpected and fun. But it did make a strong impression. And when they showed the gameplay, I feel like they seamlessly cut into the game from that point. And people were kind of thinking it looked good enough from that demo to like, wow, is this like our first look at a PS5 game?
Yeah.
In retrospect, you can tell it's PS4 era, but it does make a strong first impression with all that foliage. Their foliage system is still just incredible. They really know how to do long grass and make it look cinematic and react to the player's movements in a way that you don't often see. And it's just got a lot of dramatic skies and really cool long vistas. Just a beautiful game.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've just been looking at another PC, which is the Frankenstein PC, which has the Xbox Series X CPU combined with the RX 6700, which is the closest architecturally you're going to get to the PS5 GPU. And we're talking about cutscenes. Most of it, the settings I chose are basically high. We'll figure out if that is actually PS5 equivalent in due course. I mean, we've literally had the game less than a day at this point. Yeah. But that initial cutscene is actually quite heavy. I'm targeting 1800p resolution here, similar to the PlayStation 5's frame rate mode. But I'm using dynamic resolution scaling with XeSS upscaling here. And that initial cutscene, mostly in the 50s, can dip down into the 40s, but and that initial sort of oceanside battle there, mostly 60 with some dips, but gameplay is much more consistent, sort of what you might call like a 50 to 60 FPS window. So on a VRR screen, it would be perfectly fine. And again, just, what can I say? Even on high settings, well, I say even on high settings, just looks really, really good, performs really, really well. I don't really have any complaints about this port. I guess if Alex was here, he would be regaling the lack of stutter. I didn't see any stuttering at all. Although, didn't you have some blips with frame gen? John,
yeah, I feel like with frame gen, when it's not perfectly level with the refresh rate that you're targeting,
FSR
with FSR only,
right?
There is a slight perceptible stutter or judder. It's not really stutter; it's like judder, where it makes the game look like VRR is not working to some degree,
right?
If you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe not as severe, but there's something about the fluidity. Like when the camera rotates, it doesn't look as smooth as it should, despite the high frame rate and VRR being enabled. I noticed this in Avatar as well with frame gen, FSR3 frame gen, and it's a weird thing because they're so close to making it work super well, but that problem persists. DLSS FrameGen does not exhibit that.
Right. I spotted some occasional blips to about 30 milliseconds on DLSS 3 in that initial intro section, the initial cutscene.
Oh, sure,
which is quite challenging. Some of them seem to be on scene cuts, but some of them aren't. But actual gameplay, again, I'm not seeing any of that. So
that's cool.
Yeah, just looking at the data there. Overall, very, very solid release. I mean, we're going to come back with some optimized settings, PlayStation 5 comparisons as per the norm. But that's going to take some time because
hopefully we were not going to find anything weird like missing visual features.
Yes.
Because it's possible, right? Like we haven't looked close enough to say like that it's perfect yet, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to require some work. From my recollection, it seems right on, but we'll have to wait and see.
I did notice some issues as well with FSR3 or FSR2 or whatever we want to call it. The naming is very confusing at this point. So it has some issues with the foliage presentation in the game. So it shimmers a lot on some foliage elements. And it does not look like intended behavior to me in a few spaces on Steam Deck. So I think there may still be some lingering issues. I did not try XeSS. so that might fix it.
Yeah.
The DP4A version of XeSS. But I think there are still some issues, some gremlins in there. I'm not totally sure that it's a completely refined port at the moment, just with a couple things like that. And then also the cutscene performance in that opening section, I'm not sure if that's like 100% where it should be, because it does hit like the low 20s on Steam Deck for some reason, even though a lot of the rest of the content is in the 40s and 50s.
That's pretty heavy, but it is a heavier cutscene than most, based on what I've played. But yeah, an interesting stress point there. And they did seem to cap those at 30 on PlayStation 5, which, well, perhaps we're finding out why.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So, that's basically our first initial comments on Ghost of Tsushima. I mean, I've played it for maybe 2.5 hours at this point,
right.
on two different systems. So, yeah, there's a lot more work to be doing on that.
I'm curious to see how it runs on higher end AMD cards, and I want to see some Intel tests as well, if possible. So
you have to send a note to Alex.
so it's exactly, making notes right now, Alex. More work for you.
Okay, that's all we've really got to say about Ghost of Tsushima, so let's move on. And let's move on to our second news topic, which is Assassin's Creed Tsushima. I mean, this week, Ubisoft revealed Assassin's Creed Shadows, that's its actual name, by the way, and they regaled us with what I might say is essentially a pointless cinematic trailer. What's the point of a cinematic trailer? I mean, do we actually get a trailer of a movie that looks much better than the actual movie's going to look? Just doesn't make sense to me.
I maintain that it's a mistake, because they use these cinematic trailers as a method for announcing that, yes, this game exists and will ship at some point. But all it does is set up potentially false expectations as to what a game is going to look like. It also tells us nothing about the game other than like the theme. It's just, ultimately, it feels like it's a bad use of money at this point, to fund these sorts of trailers, because it doesn't really benefit much.
I'm not even sure if it's in engine, but even if it is, I mean, what's the point? The final product presumably is going to look pretty good. So why show a completely sort of stylized cinematic? Doesn't make sense to me. Oliver, any thoughts on this one?
Well, like you guys, I'm very disappointed they chose to go with a trailer style that's not representative of the final product, because it doesn't communicate what the game looks like. And I think critically, something that I'm noticing now with games is that the quality of some games' real-time graphics, when you look at a title like certain, elements of a game like Marvel 1943, for instance, that is a game that is actually approaching the quality of offline CG. So when you watch a trailer like this, I'm like looking through and I'm trying to tell, is this real-time? Is it in-engine? Could this be done? Like, it's sort of hard to tell at some point. And it does make it look a little bit more misleading than it used to be, because it used to be that you could more easily tell the difference. Now it's getting much harder. So beyond that, I don't know. I don't really want to comment too much on the trailer itself, because it's obviously not representative of the final game, which Ubisoft released some screenshots, actually, some very limited screenshots, I think 4 or 5 screenshots, which showcase a lower detail art style with much less density, a little bit more stylized. The lighting is much more basic. The models are cruder. The character rendering is not even close. It's a lot more what you would expect from a current-gen game, or maybe even a last-gen game in some respects. So it looks very good. It still looks very good, and it's still a very attractive-looking title, but it's not anywhere near the quality of this trailer, which is unfortunate, because I think if they just shown off footage from the game, I think that would have been more representative, and I think players would have still been excited about the title, and there wouldn't have been this wave of disappointment that hits some players when they realize, hey, this title doesn't actually look as good as that initial showing presented it as.
It's a weird kind of marketing, isn't it, where you come out with a trailer that looks absolutely amazing, and then inevitably your very next marketing beat has to show the game not looking anywhere near as good as this. I mean,
right. Presumably.
It just makes no sense whatsoever.
I mean, I guess the only sense there is that this gives them a chance to announce the game, and they can usually just outsource these trailers so it doesn't impact the actual development team's production cycle at all. But I actually still think Ubisoft should take a page from Watch Dogs, but do it right. You know what I mean? Like Watch Dogs obviously got a lot of flack because the original demo was so good and then the final game didn't live up to it. So same as the CG trailer problem. But if they can find a way to show a demo of the gameplay that looks like the game will actually look, and I know harder to produce than it sounds, but and show mechanics and things to get people excited, I think that does make more of a splash than this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yes, a little bit more difficult to execute, but it could pay off big time if they do it right, provided the game is actually interesting enough to warrant that, of course.
Yeah. This was also an issue with not Assassin's Creed, Star Wars Outlaws, where that initial trailer looked outstanding, but I also seem to recall you and Alex and us discussing it and not being quite sure what the provenance of the trailer was at the time, right? We weren't quite sure initially. Right. And then, of course, we see footage later from the game that looks like, it looks excellent. It looks really good. It's probably going to be one of the standout titles, I think, of this year, technically speaking. And so it sort of begs the question, like, why did you show that initial presentation to us when you had footage from the game that you could have shown us alternatively? Now, maybe that isn't the case here, but you could have maybe presented us something that is more representative of that final product and still got players excited.
So Assassin's Creed, you might argue, has been in something of a rut since Valhalla. I mean, how do you follow Valhalla?
That was the rut.
Yeah, unfortunately, it was mega successful and people loved it.
No, it's well made. I just don't like it.
I guess the question is, where do they go next from a gameplay perspective? And I've just watched through this trailer for like the third time. I still don't really have any idea as to what we should actually expect from the game.
They've never. So it's too late. It wouldn't make sense for Assassin's Creed. But what I've always wanted to see with Assassin's Creed is essentially like you have this open world environment, but the individual missions you undertake are more in line with something like Dishonored or Thief, where they're complex, bespoke environments and maps designed specifically for that mission. But obviously, that is a ridiculous amount of work. The amount of work that just went into each mission in Dishonored is insane. And then couple that with a big open world game, and I can see how that would become very difficult and expensive to make. But they're already pouring so much into this stuff anyway, and I'd actually rather see reduced open world scale. And more of a focus on making quality mission areas.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Which they don't really do. I feel they just use the open world map usually as the mission, and it's just not as engaging. I feel I'm not a big fan of the way especially the last few games have been. Although the one last year was at least a little bit closer to the classic Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, there is talk that you can switch between the two protagonists, interchangeably as you want, which would be an interesting use of current gen technology. There isn't going to be a last gen version of the game.
Oh, so. you mean like GTA 5 on a PS3 and 360?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The character swapping.
I just wish we'd had something more meaningful to talk about. Because
we don't, yeah.
Yeah.
I can think of a couple things.
Go on.
Please.
Okay. So one thing that they said in the interview is that they said that they're doing fully dynamic lighting. So the quote is basically that they have a fully dynamic lighting system in which the radiance from sunlight, torches, and lanterns can illuminate both the land and you. And earlier, I think in March, Tom Henderson leaked some information about the game that said that they have RTGI and virtualized geometry. So that is compelling from a technical perspective, potentially. And that would obviously fit in with rendering trends across a variety of AAA engines this generation, would represent a big improvement over prior games, potentially, depending on how the quality shakes out, of course, but also enables them to interestingly do new things with this title, like have changing seasons they mentioned. So they have...
Ah, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So maybe that's the kind of thing that, hey, if they have RTGI in the mix, that makes it easier to do lots of extensive changes in terms of the environment. And they also mentioned destructible elements, so that could be part of it as well. So it could be a more dynamic Assassin's Creed title in addition to a better looking one.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of just brings us back to the question of why this trailer. If you go back to like the classic trailers of the past that have actually made an impact at, when they were revealed, obviously number one, the GOAT, as it were, would be the Metal Gear Solid 2 trailer, which wasn't just cinematic, but actually showcased gameplay systems and made you want to play the game, which, I think I just don't quite understand why you would put out a cinematic which, essentially just shows anything, really. I guess you get the two protagonists, but beyond that, you get feudal Japan, but you don't really know if that's going to be how it looks in the actual game. But I guess that will be reserved for the second marketing beat, which I would assume comes with Summer Games Fest / whatever it's called this year.
Ubisoft Connect, is there going to be one of those? Do we know?
They'll probably do an Ubisoft show, yeah.
We should probably raise the caveat, like, if the game ships and it actually does look like this initial teaser trailer, I think we should all apologize to Ubisoft and say sorry for doubting your technical wizardry.
Okay.
So I think we can agree to that, right? If it actually looks like that trailer, we can do that.
Although the initial screenshots don't look like this trailer.
So. No, they don't, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Okay. Not too much more to say about this one, so let's crack on. Okay, so next news topic, a lot of PlayStation news this week, and we're going to kick off with the announcement that 2 PlayStation CEOs are actually going to be replacing Jim Ryan, who was one PlayStation CEO. And they seem to have split it into software and hardware and platform, and taking care of the software side of things. Good news, I guess, because we've actually got a game developer doing it. It's Herman Holst from ex-Guerrilla Games. He recently took over the full gamut of Sony studios. He stepped up. And secondly, on the hardware / platform side, Hideaki Nishino, I think we met him, didn't we, John, virtually, to talk about the PlayStation 5 interface?
I believe so. He had a lot of cool stuff in his background, if I remember as well.
So yeah, that's just basically some
cool.
corporate news on what's happening at PlayStation. Seems like good news on the face of it to have experienced people who've been at the coalface, so to speak, taking over those roles. Secondly, we have news that there's now been a total of 59 million PlayStation 5 consoles shipped. Helldivers seems to have been a gigantic, massive success for Sony, possibly its biggest launch of the generation. Which obviously opens up some interesting questions about
ever. It's being said that it's the fastest selling first party game they've ever released.
You're quite right. Yeah. Sales far exceeding expectations. 12 million copies. Wow. Sold across PC and PlayStation 5 in its first 12 weeks. John, what do you think about that? Do you think you actually floated the possibility on X/Twitter this week that they should just go all in on multi-platform launches.
And people didn't like that.
People didn't like that, did
People
they?
did not like that. And thinking more about it, I would say that the multi-platform strategy that they've currently kind of discussed does probably make the most sense for now, where multiplayer focused games, specific things that make sense on the PC, should launch day and date on PC. But I guess I can see the argument that the more cinematic style, the bigger those types of releases, maybe there is something to be said for having it only on one platform initially, and then showing up as a PC port perhaps later. I would at least like to see the PC port period reduced a little bit, maybe, but again, I guess another benefit though of launching those games just for one console is the development studio can put all their focus onto making sure that singular version is good. PC ports are obviously rough. I can imagine it would be very stressful for a studio like Nixie's to launch day and date with a console game, because the console game will have been in flux, the code base, throughout a lot of its development, right? And they would obviously be limited by that, which would make their job even more difficult. So maybe it's not always the best move. I assume Helldivers is a case where it was being developed simultaneously internally for PC and PS5 because it was, a multiplayer game where they can play together.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess the most logical thing for now is just doing it on a case-by-case basis and see where it ends up. But clearly in this case, it paid off gigantically in a way that actually surprised me. Although, I mean, because Helldivers 2 technically it's kind of the same as the original Helldivers. It's just they changed the camera perspective, which does make a difference in terms of intensity. But even I have to admit, I don't usually play multiplayer games guy here. I do like Helldivers too. It is
Great.
fun. The thing is, though, is it actually feels more like an older style multiplayer game, right? It does feel more like an earlier 2000s kind of thing where you just hop in, hit the button, you're just launched into to a round with people if you want, and you're just going down there. You play around, have some fun, and hop back out. It doesn't feel. It doesn't have as much of the meta that we see in a lot of modern games, even though there is definitely some stuff to earn. It's not as extreme. It feels a little more pure. And I think people appreciate that. But it's also, I think these types of situations are, there is a sense that a lot of publishers are very focused on looking at these successes and say, I want that success too. We've got to get that success too. But this stuff happens organically, and it's usually by surprise. I'm not so sure that you can engineer this kind of success in most cases. I don't think somebody can say, well, we got to do our own, we got to have our own Helldivers too, or that type of success, and then spend 5 years trying to make that success. They probably won't have that success, right? That's what the market's kind of proven. And these ideas kind of just show up at the right time with the right audience, and it just sort of spreads. And I think that's what makes this kind of business so difficult, because obviously if it hits big, as it did with Helldivers 2, but they usually don't hit like that.
You're quite right. I'm still sort of perplexed by this distinction between games that are quote unquote allowed to be multi-platform at launch and those that seem to be extremely, where the PlayStation audience seems to be extremely sort of protective about it. I mean, ultimately, what's the difference between single and multiplayer? Defining that distinction.
The main concern that I saw expressed centers on just a reason to own the platform, to get excited about the platform. It really comes down to that. And everybody's convinced that launching day and date on PC will kill the excitement around
I don't
that
see
single
it.
platform.
It didn't kill the excitement of Forza Horizon 5 or anything like that,
And that's all of these people pointed towards Xbox as a reason why this strategy is a failure. But I think that misunderstands the Xbox situation more than anything, where it's not. I don't think Xbox's failures are specifically due to always launching day and date on PC. They're much, much, much deeper than that. And a lot of it ties into the quality of the software itself. Forza Horizon 5 is one of the few that actually had a good buzz around it and was a genuinely good game. That's something Microsoft has struggled with for like the last however many years. They just aren't able to produce these types of games that get people talking by and large. Nintendo and Sony they're just flat out better at doing that right now, right? But I think they've reached the point. I mean, that's a whole different conversation of their strategy changing. But so I think I see the point of people wanting it to stay exclusive, but I also understand like this isn't just like copying the Xbox model either, and it wouldn't necessarily spell disaster for them.
No,
I would say.
Not. I mean, people need to understand that the target market for a console is different to the target market for the PC, quite substantially so. You can't have a PC logistically working nicely in the living room connected to your TV. It's a different type of model. Just as
you can, but
not in a way that's acceptable to the mainstream.
No, not at all.
So the concept of PCs being in living rooms is an extremely niche thing. Similarly, the concept of PCs being in bedrooms is a niche thing relative to the console space as well. Let's say you've got people who just can't be bothered with wanting to tweak settings or install driver updates or something like that. They're two entirely separate markets. Where I accept that there are logistical issues is in the quality of the ports.
Right.
And Nixis have told us that it takes them a year to basically port a PlayStation 5 game over to PC. Now, if that's the amount of time it takes, fine, right? What I will say, though, is that the longer the time gap between the console release and the PC version, the fewer the PC version sales you're going to get, simply because you're lacking the bulk of the marketing oomph that was put behind the initial launch. So I think there is very definitely a discussion to be had about trying to reduce that gap from, well, it's like 2 years at the moment, isn't it? Trying to reduce that gap down to a year maximum, or better yet, like, 3 or 4 months. And I think that still wouldn't upset the console users that much, because, they would have moved on to the next thing at that point.
There is still an argument to be made, though, that launching on PC incurs fees. If you're launching on Steam, for instance, there are Steam fees. They basically lose 30%, I would say, on each unit sold, versus when they sell it on the PlayStation Store or sell a retail copy. So that could potentially have a negative impact, I would say.
Yeah, potentially.
Something to
absolutely.
consider.
Yeah. Which again,
they don't have, unlike Microsoft, which, for better or for worse, Microsoft has tried their own store within Windows and most people hated it. Sony hasn't gone that far yet, and hopefully they don't. So I think so far, at least, they understand that the PC audience wants their games on Steam, but obviously Steam, they take a cut. So if they try to get that cut back and launch their own store, I could see why, but I also could see that ending in disaster for them.
Well, just make the store good, right? Good features.
Even if it's good.
Cross-compatibility with PlayStation.
And I'm not convinced it would be, but even if it is good, I think PC gamers, and me included, are tired of these extra darn launchers. We don't want to put our credit card information in all these different systems. Although on PlayStation, I guess there's more likely you'd already have a console set up, so maybe it's a little easier there. But still, I don't know. Are you guys happy to keep installing more of these launcher apps? Because I'm kind of tired of them. I don't like having so many of them.
Launchers are a huge pain, especially with Steam Deck. It just makes.
Oh yeah, exactly. When you get into Steam Deck, it gets even worse. It's just you have to jump through hoops to deal with that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not great that Valve has an effective monopoly or close to a monopoly on the sale of PC game keys through storefronts.
I would say this though, Oliver. They are at least a private company. They are not publicly traded, which that alone is pleasing, because they're not beholden to the typical shareholders that have caused so many other issues. I know it's a bit naive and simplistic to say it, but that is one benefit of Valve in its current form.
Anything to add to that, Oliver?
No, I mean, I think that Helldivers 2 is awesome. I think it's a great game. I'm glad to see it being successful. Although I do kind of wonder, is this just one of those titles that's going to end up as a forever title, like Roblox, like Minecraft, like Call of Duty,
that's what they want.
Yeah, but then if it just kind of gets up in that echelon of games, maybe this is not really a replicable success. Do you know what I'm saying? If these every so often, every one and however many titles that aim to do this just becomes this game that monopolizes player time and attention.
I'm skeptical about that, because you say stuff like Roblox, Minecraft, and the like, and those aren't just a game, right? They're a thing. It's much, much, much more than a single game. Those are actually, that may as well be a launcher onto itself. Roblox especially is basically a framework for different games, and that's why kids love the heck out of it. Whereas Helldivers 2 is one specific thing, and it may last for a while, but I don't think it's comparable to that sort of platform. And even Fortnite, which started as kind of its own thing, is obviously expanded out significantly.
Sure.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of other PlayStation news released this week. There was an interesting tweet from Stephen Totillo saying that we've got a pretty big number of active users, monthly active users on PlayStation, 118 million. That's not insignificant. However, half of them are still on PlayStation 4. Half of them, 3.5 years into the console generation. That's quite remarkable. And also some shipping news from other sources. They seem to be, I'm not sure it's official sources as such. It seems to be research firms. Nico Partners, shared on X by Daniel Ahmed, the company's director of research and insights, basically saying that Sony shipped 4.5 million PlayStation 5 units during the 3 months ending in March, 59.3 million shipped total. However, there seems to be a vastly reduced amount of Xbox consoles shipped. it's saying it's 5-to-1 ratio. It could actually be a bit higher. I also saw a figure of 800,000 Xbox consoles shifted. PlayStation seems to be kind of matching or slightly beneath the sales curve of PlayStation 4 during its life cycle, but there is expected to be decline going forward. John, this Xbox stuff, I mean, it just continues to be bad news for Xbox, seemingly. In actual fact, we got this supporter question from I_like_licorice. Hey DF, exclamation point, with the recent news that PS5 outsells Xbox 5-to-1. Well, let's first of all say they shipped 5 more times more units than Xbox. Shipping isn't sell-through, I think it's safe to say. But anyway, I think it's safe to say that Xbox Series XS is a failure, especially considering that it's released by Microsoft, which has access to unimaginable capital, and they expect a high return on investment from their products. If I'm not wrong about the current Xbox being a failure, why did it go this way? Is it really because of the power of first-party Sony games? Also in Europe, where I live, a quote-unquote console is often synonymous to a quote-unquote PlayStation. A weekend player can get a PC, a console, or a Nintendo. Finally, Sony consoles have always been great. Is it the legacy of previous systems and the nostalgia that makes the mass-market customer pick a PlayStation? Honestly, Microsoft only had a single superb console. It's not an impressive track record. Thanks, exclamation point. I think there's a couple of points I'd take issue with there. Microsoft had some excellent consoles.
Yeah.
OG Xbox, I'd say, was excellent. Came to a premature end, but it wasn't down to Microsoft.
It's sold more than the Series S and X has so far in a similar time frame too.
Yeah, 360 speaks for itself. I'd say Xbox One X was another superb console. But anyway, there is a point being made here.
The OG Xbox shipped 24 or sold 24 million estimated, and Series consoles are estimated more in the 21, 22 million, I guess, right now.
Okay.
And they've both been on the market. That would have been the same amount of time on the market, because Xbox was only on the market for like 4 years.
It does kind of suggest, I mean, shipping consoles doesn't require you to sell consoles. It just seems, I don't know what's going on here. Has Microsoft taken the foot off the gas?
Wow, the Quest 2 sold 20 million units.
These stats aren't getting any better, are they?
And Nintendo GameCube as well sold about the same as Series X and S.
Do you think this is at a corporate level, just, handling a difficult transition period into whatever Xbox 2.0 is?
I don't know. I think we can all kind of agree that there's many challenges with the way Xbox Series launched. It felt more like Xbox One X2. You know what I mean? And PS5 suffers from this to a degree as well, I'd argue, but it's especially true here. From the same dashboard, it basically didn't have any launch titles. Like, all the games that were available on day one were basically just like also Xbox One games. It just didn't feel like an event. And then despite all their studio acquisitions, they've really struggled to get like games out the door. Like, there's been good games coming out from Xbox, but most of them just don't get the attention, or they're not on par with the best from Nintendo or Sony. And I really think there's like a perception problem that's kind of just fed out over time that they've not been able to beat back. I think things would have looked different a little bit, possibly. So this is a lot of what if, but like, the original plan was Halo Infinite was going to be a launch title. And when you look at the original trailer for Halo Infinite, there's original ambitions. If they had managed to actually deliver Halo Infinite and live it up to those promises and really feel like the return of Halo, I think that would have absolutely changed the fortunes of Xbox Series X and S.
Yeah.
But I really think that 343 holds a not insignificant amount of quote unquote blame for the state of Xbox, in a weird way. Like, their stumbles and inability to deliver on Halo Infinite. It was a year late and nowhere near what people had hoped. I mean, the multiplayer's at least recovered somewhat, but the campaign is still, it's not what many of us wanted, I will say.
I think, the nature of the business is that it's changing, right? 50% of active PlayStation users still being on PS4 is indicative that their initial stated aim to get people moved on to PlayStation 5 as quickly as possible, I'd say that has also been a failure. I mean, it's just been the fact that these persistent games, your Fortnites, they're just
moving at the same speed as PS4, right? Like they're getting PS5s in the homes at a similar pace to the PS4, which is good, but it shows that because, like you say, with the way games are today, people have less of an issue just holding on and continuing to play the older machines. And I'd be curious to see what those numbers looked like in the past, like when, like PlayStation 2 launched. PS1 games continue to arrive. People continue to play on those, but because they're not online, we couldn't really have any strong indicator as to how many people were actively using it at that point, right?
What do you make of this, Oliver?
Well, I don't know. I'm really depressed by it, to be honest with you, because I think, actually, I know the game lineup has not been so good, but I think the Xbox hardware this generation has been very good. I think the Series X and Series S are good machines. And I think there have been some good games on Xbox for sure, even if they've been far between. In particular, this year, when you look at the lineup, it's like Hellblade, Indiana Jones, Avowed, Flight Sim 2024. I think that's a very strong lineup. Relative to Sony, it's a much stronger lineup, I think, than Sony has this year.
I agree.
So the idea of Microsoft potentially abandoning console hardware to some degree or another, obviously, it's sort of a question mark as to what the next Xbox hardware will look like. I just think that's kind of an unfortunate question. I think the writing is probably on the wall to some degree for this generation, given the current balance of sales. I mean, it certainly seems like a pretty dire situation. But I think definitely the situation could get better, pivoting to more interesting hardware configurations, doing more with PC. I mean, there's obviously a roadmap that they seem to be following at this point, although it does seem to be changing frequently. But just this essential balance between the PlayStation and Xbox has been something that we did see in the 360 PS3 generation. I personally thought that was a great generation for games in a lot of respects. It's something we saw a little bit more of last generation relative to this generation. And now that's sort of falling away. I understand the factors that are behind it, but I still think, hey, the Xbox Series hardware, it's still good. It still should have a place in the market. And frankly, I'm surprised that it's being outsold by the degree that it is.
Okay.
Rich, I have another factoid on sales numbers. Do you know that the Master System sold almost 13 million units?
1.3 or 3.0?
1.3.
Okay.
That's not, that's pretty good for the Master System.
You're trying to goad me.
A little bit. You want to play some Afterburner 2?
Not on the Master System. Saw your Sunsoft video where even the NES version caned it.
It did. Oh my goodness.
Dear. Yeah. We somehow got from PlayStation 5 to the Master System.
I agree with you though, Oliver, by the way. I wanted to chime in and say that I actually think the Series X specifically is the best piece of hardware Microsoft's ever made. I just think it's a really nicely architected machine with a lot of smart design features. It works super well with all the modern standards and just delivers a lot of oomph. It's great. It's just it hasn't, their whole business shifted so much that it's no longer about that, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of love gone into Xbox and a lot of great features there. I mean, historically, their support for different displays has just been first class. I mean, go back to Xbox 360, VGA component, HDI, HDMI, and obviously they had those supports for all of those arbitrary resolutions. It's just fantastic. And then, once we move into the Xbox One and the Xbox Series era, their support for forward-looking features on the cutting-edge displays is still first class. Yep. The VRR stuff in particular is standing out right now. But, what can you say? They've really produced some really great stuff. The back compat stuff just, still boggles my mind as to how they are able to do
good.
That. So hopefully they can take those wins going forward into whatever they're planning next. And, there's been a lot of, I noticed there was another supporter question, there seems to be this assumption that Xbox is writing off hardware. Then they're not. There will be a 10th gen Xbox. It's just the nature of it might be slightly different to what we've previously come to expect. But the core functionality, the idea of a box that sits in the living room, plug and play, easily plays all the latest games. That's not going to go away. So, the fundamentals will still be there. But with that, let's move on. Okay, interesting news that dropped just as we woke up this morning, I guess. There was an investor call with Take-Two, and it turns out that, the launch window for GTA 6 has shifted. We were previously expecting something to happen within 2025. Could have been any time at 2025. I think it's now been pushed back, or rather more localized to Q4 2025. So obviously, needs a bit more time, potentially. Some people saying it's a delay because they never actually said that they were going to be producing it at any time in 2025. But on the negative side, they do seem to have adjusted their financials to account for that particular launch window. Oliver, thoughts?
Yeah, my first thought is that people will be clearing out that release window like the plague. It actually reminds me a bit of late 2013 when we had GTA 5, Battlefield 4, and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. Here we have GTA 6, a new Battlefield, and of course, in annual fashion, a new Call of Duty. So I think that's a pretty exciting holiday season, personally, and I do think people will probably try to be avoiding it. As to whether it's a delay or not, I don't know. There were some reports that Rockstar's internal target was maybe earlier in the year, maybe spring. But the reporting at that time seemed like, that's the target. But internally, they're like, we're not. It's not going to be achieved, or it's unlikely to be achieved. So I think late 2025 is perfectly reasonable, and I think certainly what we saw in that initial trailer, I'm very excited for what they end up doing with it, even if it is a bit more of a wait than maybe it was initially targeted. But just a little bit more time.
Yeah, I guess, there's just so much going on behind the scenes that you never really have visibility on. I'd love to know what shape the game's in at the moment, but you just never know. I guess we'll get another trailer at some point. Any reactions, John?
Just that my personal expectation is that we're going to get closer to the end of 2025 and it's going to get delayed and it's going to come out in the spring of 2026.
That's going to very definitely happen.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, Rockstar usually does seem to launch these in the spring anyway, and we've seen this kind of thing before, and I just feel like it seems very likely that, maybe they'll hit the target, but I have a feeling it's going to get delayed again.
They do have a pattern of late delays, like with Red Dead Redemption 2, and also with GTA 4, I believe. There were some late delays by 6 months or so.
That's what I'm expecting.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I guess this puts paid to the rumor that PlayStation 5 Pro was going to be the GTA 6 machine. Because, there was talk that it would arrive in 2024, GTA 6 would arrive in 2025, and it would be the machine to play the game on. Well, there's going to be possibly a year's delay between the Pro and the GTA 6.
It could still be the machine for GTA. Let's be honest.
It'll just be a bit later than expected. Yeah. But there was the theory that Sony is basically making this machine and timing its release so that it would tie in with GTA 6, but that's not going to happen. We also have news that Dan Houser, who obviously was the mastermind behind prior GTA games, his company Absurd Ventures, he is indeed going to be planning to make an open world action adventure game. And I've got an interesting question here from Alan, the legendary Alan. Hi DF team, Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser's Absurd Ventures has revealed they're working on an open world action adventure game. Late last year, Rockstar veterans Laszlo Jones and Michael Unsworth joined the team. Is a GTA killer on the horizon? I guess you just can't say, can you? The amount of money that's required to make that level of experience, though, to kill GTA. I mean, how much money could be sourced by a new firm? I don't know about that. It's difficult to say, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And, when is it going to come out? I think there's certainly room for more than one GTA style game simply because they take so many years to produce.
Yeah. I don't 2030, I see.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Dan Houser's game is going to be arriving anytime soon. So, as to whether it kills GTA, who knows?
The amount of money and time is like really daunting.
Yeah.
Like you'd almost think, well, what's a modern day Saints Row? What would that look like? Obviously, we had a Saints Row title,
like Saints Row,
last year that did not work out so well. But I honestly don't know if there's room for multiple like $1 billion or $500 million
from a
products.
logistical standpoint in terms of budgets and stuff. Yeah, that's a huge amount of money to be sloshing around for a single game or two games.
It's really daunting. I mean, other kinds of titles are more achievable within a framework like this, but like a title that could genuinely compete with GTA 6 on a feature for feature, I mean, it would be insanity.
Mm-hmm. We've seen GTA adjacent people spin off before, such as with Crackdown. So, it's not impossible to find something that sort of fits that catches attention and becomes a success. Yeah, but I'd expect it'd be very difficult to actually compete with GTA.
I'd love to see a new Crackdown. Go back to the series roots.
I like Crackdown 3, the single player. Mm-hmm. Everybody hated that game, but I thought I actually finished it, which is rare for this big open world games. And I actually really liked it. It was fun.
Yeah, but you know what I'm saying.
Underrated.
Right? It's not a series that should be sunsetted for sure.
No, exactly. There's a lot of potential there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. We're going to be sticking with Rockstar related news because Red Dead Redemption, there seems to be compelling evidence emerging that it is actually going to be coming to PC. And this comes from reputable data miner Tez2 on Twitter/X. He shared a tweet which seemed to show basically text dumps from the Rockstar launcher, which, basically says that the game is coming to PC. In fact, the actual string of text reads, "Journey across the sprawling expanses of the American Western Mexico in Red Dead Redemption and its zombie horror companion Undead Nightmare, now playable on PC." So, does seem to be sort of extremely compelling evidence. Oliver, what are you expecting from this? Because fundamentally, I will be extremely surprised if it's anything more than what we saw on PlayStation 5.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, I don't know. I'd be very surprised to see something that was much more capable or much more feature-rich than what we saw on PS4 and PS5 consoles. This is way, way overdue, considering the original game shipped all the way back in 2010, and there was controversy over the lack of a PC port even then, right? It was a PS3 and 360 title.
And the fact the sequel came out on PC.
Yes, that's true as well. So I covered this last year on PS4 and PS5 consoles. Then I also took a look at it when they updated the PS5 code to run at 4K 60. And you can get the PS5 code running at 4K 60 with FSR2 in sort of its native AA mode, so to speak. And here for the PC code, I mean, I would expect something similar. Maybe they'll support arbitrary frame rates. That's also a possibility, of course. I think this game is really played best with a pad, though. I mean, they could add DLSS. I'm sure they'll add the suite of temporal upscalers. I'd expect more than just FSR2, but I'm also not really that excited about the prospect of a game that is basically just going to, match the console versions feature for feature. I mean, you can do a little bit more with it maybe, but if you're already getting a 4K 60 experience on the PlayStation 5, there's not really that much exciting in the PC version, to me at least.
Absolutely. John, what would you want from Red Dead port for PC?
I don't really have much interest in it, to be honest, but I would just imagine it would run like absolute grease lightning. It should run on everything. You should be able to run at 90 FPS on the Steam Deck OLED with great image quality, and just that's what you expect. It needs to, at this point, like, if it's anything other than like an extremely ultra smooth, optimized, low requirement port, I'd be kind of bummed out. Like, you just expect that now, right? I guess the most exciting thing would be if people start playing around with the RTX remix stuff, and
if it ships with like DX9.
I don't think that's going to happen. I think it'll probably be DX11, 12.
It probably will be, but when you look at the age where it's from, like, conceivably,
it would be great to have that sort of.
It could have happened, but it's probably just going to be whatever modern APIs that they're using, of course.
But path tracing would be a great add. I have to admit.
God, it would be so cool, right?
It's just based on the low expectations. I'm just expecting you. I mean, if you look at the PlayStation 5 version now, I'm just predicting support for ultra wide and other upscalers. And anything beyond that, I mean, it'd be great. I mean, possibly there would be some advantages to pushing out draw distance and density, but they're already pretty decent. So I'm not sure what the actual visual return would be.
I mean, I would love a no more LODs mode. Like in Crisis, you can put in that command to just like push the LODs all the way out and draw everything in full detail.
On an open world, the memory
it's so demanding, but it would be freaking cool to see it just on an older game. Like, yeah, just draw everything.
Yeah.
I mean, it would even on Red Dead, that would probably be pretty expensive, but it would be cool to see.
I do have a couple of requests that are not unreasonable, I think. The first request...
List your demands.
My demands. My first request is an Xbox release because...
Yes. Okay, yes.
Oh.
The Xbox versions are still running the backwards compatible code, and that seemed like almost sort of defensible back when I covered these games on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 because they weren't that much better than the Xbox code running in backwards compatibility with the 9 times resolution and all that, 3x3 on the resolution there on Xbox Series and Xbox One X consoles. But now that the PS5 version is 4K 60 with that really nice FSR2 to clean up the image quite a bit relative to the MSA, I believe that's on the Xbox. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely a version that should exist on Xbox Series. I also think it would be nice while we're at it if they could maybe update more of the UI to use higher resolution elements, because they use high resolution button icons, which I think are like on the technical requirements checklist and whatnot. They need to do that. But the other elements of the UI are still just upscaled to 720p, which does not look too great, unfortunately. So there's a lot of like low-hanging fruit with that port. I think they could probably clean up a little bit, but unfortunately that's not what they did. So I don't know if it'll be fixed.
We have this supporter question from Carty Cinema. Guten Tag, TF! Exclamation point. With the news of this possible Red Dead PC port, what are the odds that Rockstar gives it an FPS cap like they did with LA Noire on PC? Do you think we'll finally be able to play this masterpiece at 120 FPS, which is already possible with Xenia, which is the Xbox 360 emulator? Cheers and keep up the good work. Well, the FPS cap on LA Noire was like a 30 FPS cap, if memory serves.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that it would be suboptimal to have a 30 FPS cap on Red Dead Redemption. I mean, I think if we look at things from an Occam's razor perspective, right, which is like the most likely scenario, the work that was done to take the game onto the PlayStation 4 will likely be the same, and the Switch, by the way, will likely be the same work that would be the technical foundation of a PC port. In which case, I mean, the PlayStation 5 version ran at 60, so I would expect that, the game should be able to run at 60 and possibly beyond. So hopefully there won't be a 30 FPS cap on an Xbox 360 class game. But obviously, if there is information included in the Rockstar launcher, this release could be very, very soon, and that's quite exciting. And with that, let's move on to our next news topic. John, I'm just going to hand this one over to you because it's John Central here, PO'd from Night Dive Studios. He's out. You've played it, you love it, and you want to talk about it.
Well, yeah, I wanted to highlight this one because I was doing another Night Dive video recently that'll come out next week, I guess, by the time you see this, or after System Shock Console. But they've also released PO'd, and I'd be curious to know what percentage of the audience watching this has any idea what the heck that is, because PO'd was essentially this very, very strange, otherworldly first-person action game that first released in the 3DO by a small company called Any Channel. It did get a PlayStation port as well. And what made it weird beyond the themes and the creatures and strange visual designs was it had this like sense of verticality to it, where you're just like navigating very strange geometric structures in full 3D, often vertically, while just dealing with all kinds of strange challenges, platforming, combat. I mean, you're like this crazy chef dude with a frying pan as your first weapon. but you end up getting legit weapons. But it also has, because of its heavy reliance on a mix of textured surfaces with flat shading, it kind of reminds me a little bit of MDK, and just in terms of that strangeness, which I found very appealing. It's just an example of a game from an era before everybody had figured out like the formula for first person games. And this just feels like a crazy, wild experiment. And I kind of blown away that Night Dive decided to remaster it just because, hey, that's cool. That's what they do. To me, that says like, that's both good from a Night Dive freedom perspective. Like they're able to actually do something like this. And also like Atari, who owns them now, basically saying, like, can you imagine Embracer Group at this point being like, yeah, gents, go ahead and make a new version of PO'd for the consoles.
Yeah.
I don't see them being okay with that, but that's
or
exactly
PO'd
what we
on
got here.
Game Pass. Go for it. Let's do that at a Microsoft studio.
Exactly. But the cool thing here though is that especially on 3DO, it did not run well. It was a very choppy game.
Okay.
It was better on PlayStation, but 3DO was rough, dude. And it's also one of the few games that has visual bugs when played in backwards compatibility on a PS2. So like the sprites kind of break in a weird way if you do that. So it's this new version though supports new and older consoles, so last gen and current gen. If you play it on any of the modern systems like Xbox Series X, S, PS5, you get a nice 4K 120 FPS presentation, which is great.
Yep.
It's got all the niceties you expect from Night Dive, including, all the FOV adjustment, which it was a narrow FOV originally, so it's nice. There's a bunch of visual features you can turn on and off to sort of change the look of the game. You can either enhance it a bunch, or you can kind of go with the original strange aesthetic. I haven't actually tested it yet, but like most of their ports, I suspect it supports mouse and keyboard. I need to try that for sure, but every other Night Dive game that they release has mouse and keyboard support. So another nice thing there. It's even on the Switch. It's nice there. Like basically it's what you expect from Night Dive. It's a remaster of an old game with lots of quality of life features, great technical implementation, perfect performance. If you're up for some PO, there's really no better way to play it, which is something I never thought I would say, ever. There's no better way to play PO'd, but now I can say it.
Well, all those features, John, it's what the original developers would have wanted.
I would say, yeah. I mean, because playing it on 3DO,
good
man.
performance, certainly, but
it was bad. I do have a copy of it on 3DO. It's upstairs though.
I'm just trying to piece together the commercial proposition that the guys at Night Dive put together to actually greenlight this project. I mean, it's amazing that this stuff happens. I just don't understand how it does.
And that, again, that's one of the reasons why I'm such a staunch supporter of what Night Dive does, is because they're able to do stuff like this. Like the idea that there's a market for PO'd in the modern era is insane to me. And I'm so happy that they were allowed to make this. That's awesome. So like, that's why I support this stuff. I recommend supporting this stuff if you're into this kind of quirky thing. Like bringing back classic games that were not remembered well is an awesome thing to do on top of the ones that were, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they really seem to be like, to me, this like further gives this like feeling that these guys really want to try to bring back all the stuff. They want to do new versions of all the games that were on PC back then, and breathe new life into them. Or console, of course, and find new ways to let people experience them. And I love that that's possible. And it seems that with the way they work, their budgets are such that they're able to support these sorts of projects. We don't know the numbers, obviously, but it must be working.
Well, I think there's something else to it, John, which is it's a very small company, relatively speaking, right?
Right.
They rely on key individuals who do fantastic work. And in that respect, there are certain parallels with what we do. I mean, there's content that we put together that we know is not going to do huge numbers on YouTube.
True.
And the commercial case is shaky for doing it. So why do we do it? Well, two reasons. First of all, part of what makes Digital Foundry tick from a business perspective is our supporter program, and supporters really love this stuff. So, there's a different consideration there. And I guess it's the same with Night Dive, where they've got this the dedicated fan base that just loves what they do. And the further they push into these crazy projects, the more the supporters love it. So, there's probably a rump of support there. And secondly, there's the reason this project exists, I'm sure of it, is that somebody at Night Dive just really wanted to do it. And particularly on a small company where you have very individual and, highly, valuable talent, you've got to give them leeway to do what they want to do, knowing that sometimes, you're not going to sort of make a huge amount of money, but, ultimately it just makes for a happier company. So I'm guessing that must be the case with Night Dive. I mean, we met, those guys really well. We met them at Gamescom last year.
That's right. Yeah.
And, they're just genuinely enthusiastic about what they do.
Yeah, they really care.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Like, it's exciting to them. Like, this is the stuff they want to do. And it's about, they got to make money to survive, but it's not about making all the money. And I think this is an example of how that can pay off. When you find your niche and you do it well and you love what you do, people recognize that and they appreciate it. And that's definitely the case here.
Oliver, you must be completely mystified by this entire discussion.
Oh, I'm captivated. P.O. was a huge game of my childhood. No. No, I don't even think I was born when this game came out.
No, probably not.
Yeah, no. P.O. Yeah, I think it's fantastic that they're going back to some of these older titles, even games that very few people are familiar with. If they're compelling, and they want to release them and revitalize them for more modern tastes and expectations, I think that's fantastic. But yeah, I think that probably, personally be more interested in maybe some other titles getting the remaster treatment. But I'm happy this game exists.
Give it a shot, man.
Yeah, perhaps I should check it out.
I mean, heck, these guys are like, hey, let's just do 4K native 120 frames per second with mouse keyboard support on like even a Series S. Right?
Yeah.
That's just awesome. That's great. They're just like, yeah, we're going to go all the way up, and they do it.
There is kind of like what you might describe as a black hole in the PC game scene in the 90s, where certain games would only run on certain hardware, and it all turned into a bit of a, what can you say, that was the Wild West when the 3D accelerators came along, and you just got entirely different experiences depending on the GPU you had.
100%. And that's one of the reasons I'm into retro PC stuff, because the hardware and the software combination from the 90s, it's not something you can easily recreate in software via emulation. Like stuff like PC, EM, DOSBox, they're really cool, but they don't perfectly recreate that experience to the level that you get when using the real hardware. And some stuff still doesn't work as well as it should. And unless you're into that old stuff, the chances are it's going to be tough to enjoy some of these games. They're just not going to play the way they should. And these sort of remasters basically allow them to play better than they ever could, right. Which is awesome. Mm-hmm. So
good stuff. With that, let's move on. Yep. Final news topic of the week, not especially industry-related news, but certainly personal news for John and Oliver, both of whom have updated their displays. John, you've gone OLED. Oliver, you haven't.
Yes.
Who should we start with here? John, let's talk us through your display upgrade, what you've bought, why, and whether you're happy with it.
Right. So I went with the LG G4 OLED. And part of the reason to go for this one was, well, one, I wanted to up the size a bit. So I went from 65 to 77 inch, I think, which is the same size that you have, Rich.
Yeah, good man.
77 is a good size, I got to say. Like, it's even in this relatively small space, it's just very immersive. It's excellent. I like that a lot. And the G4 to me felt like it was like the right time for a nice upgrade, because this is the second year of the micro lens array panels, the MLA layered panels that LG produced, which does allow a much higher level of brightness, especially in HDR, but also LG's SDR presentation can also, if you want, you can make it very bright, brighter than the competing OLEDs. Actually, just in terms of the settings available. And yeah, so I gave that a shot. At the same time, I'm coming from an LG CX, so I knew I was going to have to give up a couple things. And those things, it's primarily the black frame insertion stuff. You lose 120 hertz black frame insertion, and the BFI implementation as it is, it's not as perfect as it was on the CX, where the CX basically eliminated all blur. It was perfect, but the expense was the picture became quite dim. It's so dim in that mode. I was able to stand it, but I suspect if Oliver looked at it, he would just say, "Is the TV even on?" Like it was that kind of brightness loss, but I love that clarity. The G4 now is such that the black frame insertion is still very good, but because it's a much brighter panel, it now achieves the same brightness basically with BFI on as I got with the CX with black frame insertion off. So it's significantly brighter in that sense. However, it's a case that I'm more about a dark room, deep black levels. So I appreciate the brightness for HDR highlights and such. But for the normal viewing, I actually it's now so bright where I don't want to run it maxed out as I did on the CX. So it's good to have a little headroom there, but there's more to it than that. I would say, like, it's just the general, like the interface has been updated. There's more options now. It's easier to get the 444 chroma stuff. They've got the 444 chroma pass through. In addition, because before you had to specifically set your input to PC mode, which also lost you some other stuff. And there's now ways around that. It also solved a lot of the little gremlins I was having with HDMI. So I use a Marantz Cinema 40 AVR now, and I'm very happy with it. But every AVR I've used it, including this one, with the CX, there was times where, like, especially on PlayStation 5, when it would switch to VRR mode, for instance, you would hear sound, but the screen would just be black. And if you check the input, it would say, oh, it's receiving a picture, but there's no image. To fix it, I would literally just have to change the input on the TV to a different input, then change back, and then you get a picture. There's a lot of weird little things like that, specifically with HDMI 2.1 features, where it would just blank out or take too long to switch, or there would be like glitches. And it did annoy me a lot. With this new G4, however, combined with the Cinema 40, all of those issues are gone. So it just, not only that, it switches faster. Like when it toggles between modes, it's very quick now. It feels less jarring than it used to. And I've not had a single like weird dropout black screen or anything kind of like that when moving between machines, which it's a small thing, but I do like that. I appreciate that a lot. So that's cool.
Any downsides?
Downsides, I mean, besides the change in black frame insertion, I did have a weird software bug once where VRR was reported to be working, but it wasn't. Like, it looked visibly juddered, which was strange, even though it was reading VRR correctly. But that was fixed by just powering it off and back on. So being that it's a brand new set, it seems like it's a minor software bug. And as we know, LG is very good about updating their sets. Like, they're still updating the CX. I just had a new firmware not so long ago. So
yeah.
I have no doubts that they'll fix those little gremlins for sure. I guess the main thing really is, though, it's like for those, like, I'm not after the extreme brightness, but the brightness level here is extremely high for me. And I'm very pleased with that, especially for HDR. It means that I've been able to enjoy HDR using HGIG now more than before. Because HGIG is better for proper, like it means the display is not going to mess around with the tone mapping and you get a really nice full range. But on the CX, I would often use dynamic tone mapping to sort of amp up the brightness, but it did kind of flatten it a little bit. Like, it looked super vibrant, but you didn't get the darks and the lights were closer together, so to speak. But now I feel like the panel's bright enough where you don't need to worry about that. It also means Dolby Vision looks significantly better now. It's very, very intense and vibrant, which I like in just the right way. Films are very immersive at this size as well. So all good stuff there. So I'm really happy with it so far. I think it's the logical step for them. But unfortunately, I don't think it's bright enough for Oliver's eyes, who demands. He is the opposite of me. I play in darker rooms. I like deep black levels, and I don't like searing brightness. all the time. But
Well,
Oliver loves his serene brightness.
let's talk about your display upgrade journey, Oliver,
It is
because
a journey.
It's
I've
interesting.
heard some interesting tidbits. For example, you buying 3 different displays, but talk us through it.
Yeah, so it starts. It's a bit of a story. It starts in 2021. No, I bought a Samsung Q70A mostly for DF work because it supported 120 hertz, 4K, necessary at the time. It was a decent TV, but no local dimming. It was a VA LCD, so I had that for a while. But I was keeping an eye on the TVs that came out this year, especially the OLEDs, and I decided to get an OLED actually, a Samsung S95D, which is the highest end OLED in Samsung's line. It's sort of comparable roughly in terms of positioning to the Sony A95L or indeed the LG G4. So I booted it up immediately, like a great HDR picture, playing games like Dirt 5 and Dead Space. Really great looking, beautiful contrast. It's so crisp. The highlights are so well controlled. Looks awesome. And in SDR, it's mostly acceptably bright, although in like very bright content, you get that ABL, which I really don't like.
Right.
So you get like the automatic brightness limiting. It really dims the picture in bright content. But then I move on to 4K 120 content. Booted up Ratchet and Clank in the 40 FPS mode, and the game is tearing for some reason.
What?
The game is tearing.
Yeah.
It's tearing and it's super jittery, and I'm outputting 4K 120 with VRR. I switched VRR off. It's still doing this tearing. Shut down the console, restart everything, and the game is only doing 1080p 120, even though I have the bandwidth necessary for 4K 120. I have everything set up for 4K 120. It's not working. I move over to the Xbox Series X. 4K 120 in the menus is running fine, but anytime I boot up a game, basically there's that splash screen, that 2D image, and then right after the splash screen, I just lose the image. The game is still connected, the console's still running, but I lose the image. So I try a million things. Some things seem to get it to work intermittently, but it doesn't work for very long in any case. So I suspect the problem here is the One Connect box, in my opinion. There were some issues with it last year. I think I had a bum unit, basically. It's essentially an external box that you connect power and HDMI into, and it connects through one cable to the television. There were some issues last year. I haven't seen any reports of issues like mine this year. Technically, the One Connect box only supports HDMI 2.1 at 48 gigabits per second, or rather 40 gigabits per second, and not 48. But that shouldn't cause any issues with the consoles because the PS5 only maxes out at 32, Xbox only at 40. So it shouldn't be any issue. So anyways, I just decided that, okay, this is not going to work out for me because what if I'm covering a game and I have to double check, and I'm going to be, if I have a display issue with the game, I might think it's a problem with the game. It's a problem with my television, even if I do get this sorted out. So I said it's just not worth the hassle and the anxiety about, is this a problem with the game? Is it a problem with my television? It just seemed like a huge hassle. Plus, I'd probably be, months and months trying to troubleshoot this issue. So I just get a Samsung S90D, which is very similar. It's a little bit less bright. Looks good and it works well. I've returned the S95D by this point, obviously, so I have the money for it. Looks good, but it's a little bit dim, especially in SDR content where you don't get that peak brightness. It reminded me actually a little bit of my LG C8. I had an LG C8 back in the day. It's brighter than that panel, but it's still dimmer than I'd like. The ABL is still pretty not great. So I decided to return that. I've decided at this point that OLEDs are not quite for me. And this is where we get the television that I did end up buying. So I ended up getting a Samsung QN90D, which is one of the higher end LCD models that has, very good variable dimming and all this stuff. I plug it in and there are no issues with it pretty much from the start. I'm struck by how bright the panel is. It does up to, I think, about 2,000 nits it's been rated at.
Ooh.
in highlight areas of the screen. So in a 10% or 25% window, it's about 2,000 nits. In all white content, it's still like 800 or 900 nits. So it does have some ABL, but it's really not an intrusive level of ABL in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's very satisfying. The HDR presentation does have some flaws. It's definitely not as well controlled as you get from an OLED because it has, probably hundreds of dimming zones as opposed to effectively 8.3 million dimming zones in the OLEDs. The bright highlights are sometimes a little bit dimmer than ideal to minimize blooming, I think, and you end up with some blooming and dark content, which you can notice. But there's minimal ABL and bright scenes that looks really good. And a game like in some games, it really does make a big difference. Like in Dragon's Dogma 2, for instance, in that game's HDR presentation, I noticed on my OLEDs, it was really struggling because of the ABL and bright scenes. But on this one, it's actually quite a bright panel, even in those bright scenes. So yeah, I'm really satisfied with the panel. I think it's a good panel. I'm not actually sure if it's an IPS LCD or a VA LCD. I don't think that's been reported yet. It didn't have really nasty smearing to it like a VA LCD typically would, and it has very good viewing angles, so I'm presuming it might be an IPS LCD. But with that local dimming feature, the black levels are, in most content where you don't get blooming, the black levels are about as good as you could expect from an OLED. It's, the contrast ratio is like probably 100,000 or 200,000 to 1, judging from prior models. So it's a very good TV, and I'm very satisfied with it so far. And I just think that for me personally, I am in bright rooms mostly. I really don't like ABL. I really like bright panels. I keep this television, even though it is very bright, I mostly run it at max brightness even still. So I just think that OLEDs are not quite for me, and I think that probably there are some people who, like me, just like really bright panels with a lot of vibe and contrast to them. And actually, this panel is sort of fun because even in SDR content, you still get all that nice brightness to it. So you can actually run SDR content with HDR style brightness, and it actually looks quite good in some instances. Sometimes it doesn't look so good, but often it does look quite good. So it's a very fun and like poppy panel to show someone, and people, when they see it, they're like very stimulated by it. It's quite a overwhelming image in a way that I was not getting from the OLEDs. So it's sort of a bit of a difference in taste. I think the OLED technology is ultimately probably a superior display technology, but in terms of achieving that really bright and exciting image in all viewing scenarios, you really can't beat an LCD, in my opinion.
Oh, okay. Two different needs.
No, that's so interesting. And when I hear that, I am glad, in fact, that they make LCD still, because it does suit that purpose still. And I do agree that I've traditionally not been a fan of LCDs, but the current ones are quite good. They've come a long way. My bigger issue has always been LCDs in the PC market, because those are just dire in terms of black level quality, and they typically don't do like local dimming or anything like that. So when you have local dimming that works properly in game mode and there's enough zones, LCDs can look pretty good. I mean, the closest, the Shogun 7 that I use, by the way, they updated the firmware some years ago, like 5 years ago, actually. But like that thing goes up to 3,000 nits, but it's a 7-inch, like, it's a portable recording device. But if you allow it to run at full brightness, not only does the unit become almost too hot to touch, the screen is searingly bright. Like, it's actually kind of painful to look at. But I don't think it's meant to be like used for viewing content.
Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Well, there we go.
That's fun. No, that's really interesting. Two very different perspectives on this stuff.
Yeah, I definitely walked into this whole thing expecting to end up with an OLED, but I just think like, the ABL is something that does get to, I think most people are not really bothered too much by it, but for me in particular, it was just like, I really just want a panel that can do something quite bright.
So the way I run it pretty bright, even in SDR for the OLED bright, but I have it tuned just a little bit down, and the G4 doesn't really have much of a visible ABL dip anymore. So even when you throw up a full white screen, it retains the brightness pretty well. You don't notice it dip. The CX had a very aggressive ABL. You would notice for that. But not so much with the G4, but I'll have to try cranking it all the way to the max. The main reason I stuck with LG though, over everything else, is just because LG is really good with support for like weird input resolutions and refresh rates. So like stuff coming from like the upscalers, like the RetroTink 4K and such, where you can feed in, like, you can output original refresh rates and strange things like that a lot of TVs just do not like, and they get all weird and won't accept the signal. And LGs are really good about accepting just like oddball resolutions without issue. And that's one of the reasons I've kind of stuck with them, actually. Is just you can feed whatever you want to it, and it usually works.
Okay, so let's move on to Supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week we put a post on our Patreon asking our supporters to come up with a bunch of questions for inclusion in the show. We choose the best, or rather the ones that we're best equipped to answer, although we'll be saving some of them for an upcoming episode of DF Indirect, which is our supporter-only show. Let's go straight on to this question from Gorguts with a Z. If Xbox leaves the traditional console space, it leaves Sony with a monopoly over that market. Nintendo doesn't really compete with it in that space. Only Xbox does. We know what happens when you don't have competition. We saw it with the pre-Zen Intel and somewhat at the moment with Nvidia and their 8-gig 4060 Ti's. Do you think Xbox leaving this market will lead Sony to be disincentivized to release the PS6 with large improvements over the PS5, or to price it competitively? Many thanks. John, what do you reckon about this one?
Well, first of all, I really, really strongly disagree with the notion that Nintendo doesn't compete in the same space. Like, whether they've said that or not, like, they absolutely do, right?
Yes.
They're vying for people's times, and they're in the video game space. They compete. It doesn't matter what the hardware is. They are absolutely in the same market. So It would not be a monopoly. Secondly, I don't think Xbox is leaving the market either. Like, I think they're changing strategy, and maybe hardware sales alone won't be the big thing, but there will be another Xbox. And
I think
I don't think Sony can just afford to just say, "Oh, well, job's done," and then just start making garbage. They will lose if they do that. They will lose market share. They can't afford to do that. They won't actually have a monopoly on this stuff. And if they thought they did, somebody else would come in and take it from them.
Possibly. I think the contention being put forward here is that obviously there will be next generation Xboxes because they've committed to 10th gen, right? I think the issue is the question of what that box is going to be. Now, the sort of, based on the sort of comments that have come from Phil Spencer, rightly or wrongly, the interpretation has been that there will be a handheld of some kind. And then we have the stated intention to produce a console with the biggest technological leap of all time. Now, the question is whether those two consoles will actually be traditional consoles in the sense that they're sort of widely available mainstream devices, or, as has been put forward by some people, the idea that Xbox hardware is possibly a bit more boutique in nature. That's the word that keeps coming up for some reason, boutique, which suggests lower volumes, but, it is still an Xbox, but possibly not vying in the same sort of space as PlayStation. I agree with you, John, that the competition isn't just about power. It's basically the primary competitive element is going to be money, of course, and crucially time spent on those platforms, in which case there, obviously there's a lot of competition in the gaming space and in the console space. I think Microsoft are just being a bit more forward about the fact that the console market is going to change, and the concept of what a console is, how it's priced, and how it's basically earns its keep is going to change. Phil Spencer has made noises about the idea that a box that is subsidized through the sale of software doesn't seem to be the route forward because it's not increasing the total addressable market. A cheap console isn't bringing more people into the space anymore.
Tell that to Nintendo.
Well, quite. Oliver, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I do have some concerns about it, but I'd kind of pose the question is there really competition between Sony and Microsoft now? I mean, the Series X and the PS5, they're very comparable machines, right? They serve a very similar purpose. Most games are released on both devices, and yet the PS5 is outselling the Series line of machines. I think that, also we don't know exactly what Microsoft's plans are. They may have a console that is roughly competitive. We don't exactly know what that'll look like you mentioned. And it could be very much they have like a line, or if you'll forgive me, a series of machines that comprise several price points, different mixes of the home console and portable console kind of styles of machines. And it could be that line actually induces players to buy an Xbox that would have otherwise bought a PlayStation, not because they're producing a $500 box that's better than their $500 box, but because they're interested in a portable console or they're interested in a very high-end console. And Sony isn't delivering that, but Microsoft could. I don't know, just kind of spitballing here, but certainly what we see from Nintendo is that when you give players a very compelling, different kind of experience, they might end up choosing that over the traditional $500, $400 console box that is just as much hardware packed into as small of a price point as possible.
This is a tricky one because I honestly don't think, obviously I've met and spoke to Mark Cerny a couple of times now whenever a new console rolls up, and he's never concerned about the competition. He's concerned about making the best possible box, and what makes the best possible box is essentially defined by factors that are outside of his control, such as the price and how much it's going to cost to build that machine. So I don't think the philosophy of producing the best possible PlayStation is going to change at all. The question is how much they can achieve within that price point, which is far more of a constricting factor on PlayStation than taking a look at what the opposition is doing. They don't really seem to take too much notice of what Microsoft does from a design standpoint. And, that strategy seems to have worked for them quite well. They consistently produce excellent hardware that people buy into. I just think that the whole ball game is shifting somewhat because, the pace of technological advancement is slowing down. So the concept of what is going to be able to be produced in like the 2026 to 2028 window is kind of up for grabs at the moment. We're kind of seeing that with the mooted specifications for PS5 Pro. It's not a huge advance in silicon. It's an advance in terms of a more holistic approach to what makes a games console. They've recognized that they want to have machine learning based silicon in there, as opposed to having a gigantic GPU, which they probably wouldn't have been able to do anyway with the current process nodes that are available to them. So I don't really see this as a monopoly situation. And possibly they will be the only console within that specific niche, but there is a lot of outside competition in terms of, Xbox isn't going away. They're going to have something. They're going to sort of try and pitch it to be appealing, obviously. Nintendo obviously isn't going away, and they're all competing for, players and time and money. So I'm not particularly worried about PlayStation becoming complacent in terms of creating the console. I mean, there's certainly a lot of satellite decisions that have been made which do sort of harken back to the PlayStation 3 era where maybe they got a bit too big for their boots. Do you know what I mean? But I don't see it coming into hardware design. I don't know. And with that, let's move on to the next question. It's actually two questions. And again, it's all about Microsoft, seemingly. This one from Johnny_5A. Is there much point to Microsoft porting the Xbox OS or something like it to the PC space? Mainly thinking in terms of their repositioning of Xbox as a platform, not a machine. Would the resources gained in using an OS with less overhead than Windows not translate to much more performance in games? This one from the Bruce Dickinson. And that kind of hard to believe, but we'll see. Hey DFT, please help me make sense of the Xbox PC hybrid rumors. Can you give me one reason why this makes any good sense at all? Console players don't want a PC. PC players don't want a console. No one wants to use productivity apps on a console. Steam makes its money from 30% rip-offs its storefront. There is no way they or any other storefronts are going to share these with Microsoft. So all Microsoft is left with is a half-baked console that is not able to recoup its retail loss via a dedicated storefront. Okay. John, this seems to be like two questions which are addressing the concept of Microsoft looking at gaming as something that can straddle both the console and PC space. Do you think that there is any merit to these questions? I mean, yes, the Bruce Dickinson seems to think that we're talking about an Xbox becoming a PC, but some might say it already is a PC. Whereas Johnny underscore 5A is saying, is there actually anything to gain by porting Xbox OS to PC? Thoughts?
I don't think there's anything to gain from doing that. I would start with, but I think that, well, the specific OS as it exists now, but I think for the second part, the idea I could see them going for is essentially they want to continue to have dedicated hardware that pushes things like Game Pass and their own stores as well. Sounds like the concept is simply that it's a little more open-ended than we typically see from consoles.
Yeah.
That you would still be able to access more Windows functions. But I would assume that, like a Steam Deck, it would still have a proprietary front end that would connect directly into all the Microsoft services. And I'm sure, however you feel about it, I'm sure Microsoft feels pretty good about their storefront anyway. And they're going to continue to want to sell things through the Xbox store, in addition to Game Pass. So, I mean, that seems like potentially viable strategy. Like, whether it'll work out or not, we don't know. We don't even know if that's the actual strategy yet, right? But they've got to do something, and the traditional model just isn't working for them anymore. And I feel like they need to do a big shift, something to sort of like upset the competitors, just do something different from what their competitors are doing. And this is like, this seems like about the best possible option for them right now. So I don't know.
Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a console that's more like a Steam Deck could work pretty well, assuming that things are tailored properly for it, right? So I think the concern about the kind of PC hybrid is a little bit misplaced. It really depends on how it's implemented. I don't think it's necessarily a big issue in and of itself. I think it just depends on how the specific hardware is catered to. In the case of the Steam Deck, it works out pretty well, but I think they could go further for sure. In terms of being able to operate their own storefront, I think it works really well when you get lots of scale. Xbox doesn't have a lot of scale, or at least as much as they would probably like to have. So I'm not sure they necessarily have that choice at the moment. They do have some scale, but they don't really have the scale that they did in the 360 generation to really get a lot of royalties off that. And I'd also say that, like, in terms of what they would do with the console, if it's not a big success, their losses are proportionally smaller. And also, we don't know that they'll be taking a loss in the hardware. That's sort of an assumption that's baked into prior console designs, but may not be here, depending on how they position it. Obviously, if they're positioning it as like, hey, here's an extra thing that we're doing on top of our game sales business, maybe they aren't pricing it at a loss. Maybe they are pricing it to sell and make a profit and to have its own profit generation outside of a storefront. So I think, there are a few things in there that I kind of contest, but overall I think it's like a sensible way for them to evolve their strategy, especially if the final outcome of, having a more Windows-like console design is actually a good device that works well out of the box.
Absolutely. Yeah, my thoughts on this one. First of all, when we say the next Xbox will be more PC-like, it is basically, I guess, how do we describe this? I just think it's going to offer more PC-like features, including the ability to sideload other stores, right? And the current Xbox could do this if it wanted to. There'd be some slight issues in terms of the split memory pool, but it's perfectly viable, especially on Series X. The concept of having Xbox OS ported to PC, it just, again, I suspect it already has been, and it would just allow for continuity of stuff like saves and whatnot to work more effectively, and to have a more unified platform between consoles and PCs. I guess we just need to see the full strategy about what Microsoft is planning here, because we're seeing a lot of hints being dropped, carefully placed hints being dropped. When Phil Spencer does an interview, he's questioning the concept of having hardware that's basically sponsored by game sales, revenue from game sales subsidizing the console. He's questioning that because it doesn't seem to be, as a concept, increasing the market in any way. We seem to have the same amount of players. The question is, of course, whether if he goes with a different strategy, whether he'll lose players which is the danger. Yeah, interesting questions here. But I think fundamentally, there's a lot of things in play here that are going to define this strategy. We could do with more clarity from Xbox, but I can fully understand why they won't do it now, because we're quite some time away from new hardware arriving. I think when we actually see this handheld, which I suspect we'll see sooner rather than later, a lot of things might come into focus about how this split is going to actually manifest. You know, the concept of PC and Xbox persisting on a single piece of hardware. And with that, let's move on to the next question. This one from Dajar Ko. Happy half fortnight Foundryman. There's interesting news this week that Nvidia is co-developing a mobile ARM-based SoC with MediaTek to compete with the Snapdragon X Elite on TSMC's 3nm process with a target price of $300. However, I also noticed reports on Games Radar of leaks suggesting that Nvidia is frustrated with Nintendo and looking to enter the PC handheld space, likely with this SoC. Combined SoC that brings the power savings of ARM architecture and the efficiencies of DLSS could wipe the floor with the competition. Could it even take a dent out of Nintendo and Valve? Perhaps the latter more so than the former. What are your thoughts, gents? What are your thoughts, Oliver?
I think I'm curious as to why NVIDIA is reportedly frustrated. You know, you kind of wonder, like, is it because they would like, just spitballing here, more modern hardware potentially in the device than 4-year-old CPU and GPU architectures, is representing like the vanguard of NVIDIA's handheld console efforts. I don't really know what the deal there is, but I think that like the potential for an Android console to ship with higher end NVIDIA architectures is less interesting to me, because you know, we see from the Android game landscape that there is not that much that's interesting there. In terms of higher end titles, there's a little bit in terms of like games as a service games, but it's just not super interesting to me. Well, I'd be much more interested in a Switch 2 that has a dedicated development environment and, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars of development resources being poured into it every few months in terms of the games that are being released. So,
but surely this is a play for the upcoming ARM Windows.
If it's a PC style handheld that could actually run games quite well, that's a lot more enticing. I guess we'll have to wait and see exactly how well that.
Because there's some weird stuff happening. There's an app for the Android phones called Winlater, where you know people have got Fallout 4 running on it. The Windows version of Fallout 4 running on a Snapdragon SoC. I think it's the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. With the Gen 3 version coming up soon. I mean, it's low settings, poverty settings almost, but it's running, and it's running at like 30 to 40 frames per second on a Samsung Galaxy Tab. So I'm just thinking that there's an upcoming transition concerning Windows and ARM that's possibly going to be game changing, that could potentially bring Nvidia into the mix in terms of being able to produce devices. And the concept of partnering with MediaTek I find kind of interesting, because if they're supplying the GPU, well, MediaTek presumably have some sort of custom variant of ARM that is hugely compelling to NVIDIA, when NVIDIA could just use off-the-shelf ARM designs and get their own SoCs out there. So I'm very interested to see what's going on here and why it's taking the form it is, and what is the concept of this partnership with MediaTek? Because I agree with Dajar Ko here that, you know, efficiencies of the ARM architecture plus what NVIDIA are doing in the GPU space could be really compelling, but it really does need access to the software, because you're quite right, Oliver. You know, basically producing another Android-based NVIDIA device is profoundly uninteresting at this point, isn't it? Anything to add, John?
I mean, I kind of thought of it less as a tablet phone thing and more like targeting small, slim laptop kind of designs for the upcoming ARM version of Windows, right? Because they want a powerful. I would almost venture it's like competing with some of the Apple's like thin laptops, or maybe even the iPad Pro. I don't know, with the keyboard and that kind of device, basically. Because if Windows enters into this space here, conceivably we could see some really slick hardware, and NVIDIA obviously would want to get their, you know, foot in the door, so to speak. It seems like a good way to do it. So
yeah, I think it's all going to come down to this Snapdragon X Elite SoC
Right.
to actually see what Windows runs like on a completely different style of architecture.
I mean, we've had ARM Windows before, right?
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It did not go well, but I think like the landscape for ARM-based products has changed a lot, and there's more acceptance of this stuff now.
Yeah.
And I could see it getting a larger uptick in support. And I feel like the ARM version of Windows then was like more limited as well. Like it was, I can't remember the details, but there's something about it that made it very unsavory to use. Hopefully that's not the case here.
Okay, let's move on to this question from 1040 STF, and this is like 100% Oliver. Hi,
Okay,
DF
I'll
Crew.
leave this to you.
What are your thoughts about the impressive exhibit of the new capabilities of OpenAI this week? Do you see an application in video games? Would you welcome it? On my side, as I'm not a fan of the emptiness of most open worlds, if it can help NPCs to give life to that emptiness while still keeping a strong focus on the common thread of a story, well, why not? But if AI only helps developers shorten the NPC's development, allowing them, for example, to tackle any subject, I don't see the point. I think video games are about game design and focus around it. The infinite possibilities of AI will never change that. So you're a big, I'm not going to say AI fan, but you certainly do follow the progress of all of these tools with much interest, Oliver. So what did you make of the new capabilities of OpenAI as revealed this week? Because the demos were really, really impressive.
Yeah.
And is there any kind of application to the gaming space that you find particularly compelling?
Well, for GPT-4o, which is the O stands for Omni,
Okay.
I think that there are some potentially interesting applications because it is a multimodal model. It can both take in and output text, imagery, and audio, and it does so natively. So when you're looking at audio, for instance, when you talk about maybe having a conversation with an NPC in a game, you are actually basically talking to it. It understands your audio and it's outputting audio instead of it operating through a speech to text, then the text portion of the LLM, then the text to speech, which is what we've seen from prior game demos. So it could allow for much more expressive game output, much lower latency game output, and a much greater understanding of that output. So if you're speaking to it in a harried tone, or if you're speaking to it with emotion in your voice, it should pick up on that, and it should actually be able to respond to you in a more convincing way. And it also should be able to converse with you in a way that involves interruptions. So it's not just the turn-taking style where I speak and then it speaks and then I speak and then it speaks. I can actually interrupt it and it can take that in and it can respond in real time. So there are a lot of really compelling applications of this with respect to speaking to characters. I mean, it's a lot more compelling than what we've seen from prior demos, like the, the Ghost Protocol demo or some alpha protocol. I can't remember what it was, but it was the demo that I think John Son was demoed a little bit earlier, a couple months ago.
I saw it as well.
Yeah.
The NVIDIA stuff, yeah.
So
it was a bit stilted.
Yeah. So this would be maybe a more natural way of doing that. But I still think you probably want better audio synthesis because the final actual output in terms of the audio is still a little bit computery. It's still not perfect. It's actually a little bit lower quality than some of the other text-to-speech I've seen, although it's more expressive and more natural in some other respects. And it doesn't fit in super neatly into games with set dialogue options and static tasks. So your traditional RPG that is really just presenting the player with certain, pick one, pick two, pick three in terms of the dialogue, and then tasks that are really built around quests that are very carefully handcrafted and things like this. I see it less applicable in that space. So I think it could open up new and interesting game ideas that people have not developed and ideated yet. But in terms of fitting it into conventional game applications, it's not as neat of a fit in my view.
It would need to be cloud-based as well, presumably.
There'd need to be some interaction with the cloud just to have that processing for sure.
Okay, let's crack on with the next question. This one from Gimme More Frame Rates. We now have a nice list of 2024 big game releases. I'm curious, which of the following games are you guys most interested in from a Digital Foundry tech / graphics perspective, and why? Here are the games: Star Wars Outlaws, Assassin's Creed Shadows, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Avowed, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. We might even get the next Dragon Age, but we don't know much about it. I intentionally didn't put Hellblade 2 on the list since it's launching next week and a lot was talked about it already. I think we could, can't we add Kingmakers to that list, John? It's coming this year, isn't it?
Yeah, we should add that to the list.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of this?
I mean, of the games that he lists there, I mean, obviously, Star Wars Outlaws will be interesting. Indiana Jones, of course, I'm very curious about, since presumably it's going to be still using some variant of id Tech.
Yeah.
And Kingdom Come as well. I'm really fascinated by this because they've stuck with CryEngine.
Yeah.
And it looks great in the trailer, but it's like, it's very curious to see, like, I'm happy to see a third-party developer still making a CryEngine game, especially because I love to see what happens when Alex gets its hands on a new CryEngine game.
Yes. It did look great, and it looked different as well. I think that was
it does, yeah. So I'm totally fascinated by that. Avowed, I think, is Unreal Engine 5, which, you know, I'm always up for more UE5 stuff to see what they're doing, but it's not as interesting technically to me just because it's more of a known quantity, but still looks like an interesting game.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to refresh what else is coming this year that has my attention, but those are good choices.
Oliver, what are you looking forward to?
From this list, I'd probably pick Star Wars Outlaws just because the game looks fun and the Snowdrop engine is great. It scales nicely. It behaves really well on PC and it features RT by default on the consoles. I think it looks like a fun game, so I'd probably pick that one. But in terms of games overall, I'd kind of think that my top two for the rest of the year, technically, Black Myth Wukong would be up there. It's not listed.
That's one that's missed here. Yeah, definitely.
Good call.
Black Myth Wukong seems very exciting. They've got the RTX Di on PC. Obviously, it's using UE5. Looks very, very good in the showings that we've seen. I think they're also doing RT Caustics in there as well. Very cool. I'd also say No Rest for the Wicked, although I'm not sure what we want to say in terms of that game's release date, because obviously it's not in early access already, but it might have a full release at some point later on. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that. But that game looks outstanding. John covered it in a video a couple weeks ago. I think that's incredible. So yeah, those two games would be in my most anticipated list personally, but of the games listed, Star Wars Outlaws would be my most anticipated just because I think that Snowdrop is really compelling technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to go with Kingmakers just because that trailer it's just incredible. Literally, you know, I can't remember another time where I looked at a game trailer, you know, fresh and just thought this is like astonishing. It just looks amazing fun, and the technological side of it is just like almost like the icing on the cake. But it's the sort of trailer where I saw it and I want to play the game, right? Because I just don't know what to expect. Whereas with a lot of the other games, you've got a pretty good idea of how it's all going to play out. But Kingmakers was just like phenomenal. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Kuni Baitayan. I've no idea. Say you have a 4K 120Hz panel. What is the way DF prefers to set up their games? G-Sync plus V-Sync plus Reflex? Yes. In-game V-Sync, just V-Sync? Often confused on which direction to go. I'd love to know what method you guys use. John, what method do you use?
Simple G-Sync, V-Sync with Reflex.
Yes.
It's the way. I mean, it just, for me at least, it provides the most. This is going to vary per person, but it's about image fluidity and consistency. That's premium to me. Some people value extremely fast input response, like ridiculous levels and like insane high frame rates, and they're willing to just go no V-Sync and just run it as fast as possible. And that's perfectly valid for other reasons. I just don't like the way it looks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oliver, have you given much thought to this?
G-Sync plus V-Sync plus Reflex. Basically, same deal.
Yeah.
I don't like super high uncapped frame rates. Yeah, I mean, it's just the best combination on PC, I would tend to think.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you don't have V-Sync, that's the weird thing, because you kind of have to dip into the control panel and force V-Sync on. with G-Sync, because otherwise, if the game runs at a higher frame rate than the refresh rate of your monitor, then you get tearing, which for me kind of rules out the entire point of having variable refresh rate, right? So, capping the performance level slightly beneath what would traditionally be the VSync level actually reduces input lag, makes for a better experience. But ultimately, that just solves the problem for me. And I do think 120, 144 hertz is kind of like the sweet spot, because it kind of introduces an artificial cap to performance, which means that you don't get wildly varying frame rates and input response. So yeah, that's kind of the way I would suggest doing it. The other options just don't really appeal to me. I mean, recently I looked at the HP Omen laptop, and it's a really fantastic laptop, but I really missed the fact it didn't support G-Sync, because what it meant was it automatically limited the options in terms of getting a consistent experience. And it's such a game changer in the PC space for sure. So yeah, G-Sync, V-Sync, Reflex, that's the way forward. Let's move on to this question from Lil John. Hi, DF. Any publicity is good publicity. I'm interested to hear how you think about producing repeat content on games that have been released in a suboptimal state and often with suboptimal patches. Clearly, there is great interest in redemption stories a la Cyberpunk, as well as beating the occasional dead horse like Jedi Survivor. But I wonder if games that come out in a good/great state miss out on some choice DF exposure. Notionally, John. I'm going to go to the John. Discontinue the continuity in John's here. Surely this is basically, well, here's the thing, right? Every Monday we have a Monday morning content meeting, and it's very rare, to the point where it basically doesn't happen, that I tell people what to do. It's basically, what do you fancy doing? Because I trust you guys in distinguishing what are the good stories and what are the interesting stories that you want to tell. So yeah, it is a shame if we miss out on games that are in a good/great state, but ultimately the content choices are driven not so much by, okay, we want to go back and make an example out of Jedi Survivor again, but more to the fact of how people actually want to produce, what they want to produce, because I think that's ultimately going to produce the best content. But yeah, what do you think?
I mean, I'm honored if this is actually the Lil John, but although he seems to have added an H there, so perhaps not. No East Side boys in around us either. But so I mean, I get what he's saying, where he's like, yeah, if it's a game that has issues and then it keeps getting patched, there is a chance that more videos are going to be made than if a game comes out and it's just really good, and then we make one video on it and then don't touch it again, right? Because it was in perfect state. So there's some logic there, but like, I mean, in most of these cases, I feel like that kind of coverage. I mean, not only do we not love doing it necessarily, but it's also just, it's not really good for the game, right? Like, our performance reports and stuff like Jedi Survivor can't possibly have been viewed as a positive thing for Jedi Survivor, right? Like it is a little bit more exposure, but it's still knocking the fact that even though it's a great game, it has serious technical problems, and many have not been fixed.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
I like to think that if there is a good game out there with a great technical story to tell, that we would be telling it anyway, and that would take priority over going back and looking over an older game. But ultimately, there is a great deal of interest in these games, and we often get a huge amount of requests from people on social media asking us to take a look. And I guess there's also the question of how much effort we put in. Sometimes if it's a big story, we will make a video about it. But if it's not, then we'll just include it in DF Direct Weekly, and we'd only do like a much smaller subset of tests to make the point. Oliver, what do you make of this?
I think it's a good idea if people are really interested in the games themselves. Like, I think that when we do repeat content, repeat coverage in games like Cyberpunk and The Witcher and Fallout 4... and Starfield, those are big titles that people seem to really be interested in, and when we do content on them, it seems to do well. And I mean, I personally enjoy it. I do a lot of these, and I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit conflicted about it because obviously it would be better if they weren't necessary and the games were released in a really good state to begin with. But also the redemption story is interesting. You know, it can be very compelling, very interesting. And so, yeah, and I also think that, like, for the most part, we are covering pretty much everything that's like really interesting, new and upcoming that people are interested in. Like when we do repeat coverage, it's usually not at the expense of something else that would be really intriguing for our audience, generally speaking. So like, I'm happy to do repeat coverage on games, especially because people seem to be very invested in it. And a lot of games, you know, these big titles, they just get updated and updated and updated every month. And they get improved in a way that I don't think we really saw as much of in prior generations. But now it's like a title like Cyberpunk will just be updated ad infinitum through, 4 years of patches at this point. It's kind of insane.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't covered every Cyberpunk patch. When a Cyberpunk patch comes out, typically we go to Tom and say, can you take a look at this and see if there's a story there? And if there isn't, well, then we don't do a video on it. Similarly, there's stuff like Lords of the Fallen 1.5, where, they made a big song and dance about performance improvements. And lo and behold, there were performance improvements, but it wasn't especially something that was worth doing a video about. So we just verified the information. It went in DF Direct Weekly. But I actually think that if there's the story trumps all, right? If there's a story there, we should be covering it. And it kind of doesn't matter to me whether it's a new or an existing game, as long as it's interesting. So let's move on to our final question. This one from Very Professional Dodo. Hi there, gents! ! With all the recent news, there's been quite a negative influx of discourse around gaming. So I'm wondering, what were the latest gaming and technology news that you enjoyed reading? Oliver?
Yes, this is a bit of a cheat, but personally, I'm very interested and excited in what might happen at the Xbox showcase this year, actually. In terms of positive news, just because, and I know, Microsoft's management of their Xbox brand and portfolio studios has maybe not been so good over the past week or two, but I am really excited about a new Doom game, which was leaked in the ZeniMax and Microsoft leaks, called Doom Year Zero. I'm very excited to see if they debut that. I love Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, so I'm really excited for a new Doom game if they do debut one. Just really looking forward to that. Also, Gears of War, if they show off new Gears of War, really excited to see that. And in general, I just think that kind of weirdly and paradoxically, Microsoft at the midpoint of this generation actually has a lot of really exciting software coming up. I'm sure they've
got a great lineup for this year.
It's super exciting this year and into next year.
Finally.
And it's weird they're hitting their stride at a point when the console has been outsold so comprehensively, but it's very exciting for us as gamers, I think.
Mm-hmm. John?
Oh man, that's difficult. I haven't kept that much up with, I guess in the game space, it's more stuff that I've looked at where just there's been some really cool technically releases. Like I did that video on Penny's Big Breakaway, and I just love that those guys basically went back and like all their tech and stuff is based on their own research. They basically went back and figured everything out from scratch. They solved problems that had been solved problems before, but in a new way, and they did it their own way. They used a programming language that had never been shipped in a game before. It's all their own in-house technology. I love that kind of stuff where you have a developer like that just like, yeah, we're going to do something kind of crazy that isn't really done commonly anymore, and then it comes out and it works. I think that's really cool. Mm-hmm. Those types of stories excite me. But around gaming and technology news, man, I guess I would say TV stuff. We talked about that. I think TVs in general are in a really good place. Like display technology is in a good place now. Mm-hmm.
There's a 1000 hertz TV showcase this week.
1000 hertz is hitting, like things have continued to steadily improve across all fronts there. Displays are they're getting to be excellent and overcoming some of the remaining flaws in a lot of cases, which is always good news. Wow, it's hard to come up with this just on the fly like this.
Yeah, I mean,
that's just a couple things.
Yeah, I mean, in line with what Oliver was saying, I think the Xbox showcase is going to be terrific. If we see what the Coalition have been doing with Gears, assuming it is a Gears game they're doing, I think that's hugely exciting, right? Because we haven't seen, well, that's not completely fair. The Coalition did play a part in the Matrix Awakens Unreal Engine 5 demo. That was years ago now. We've seen nothing from the Coalition about what they're doing with Unreal Engine 5. And bearing in mind what they did with Unreal Engine 4, there's leaks that we're going to be seeing what they're doing at the Xbox Showcase. If so, I'm massively excited to see it. Similarly, with what Oliver said earlier, Doom, a new iteration of id Tech specifically designed for the new generation of consoles. That's hugely exciting. The ARM stuff with Windows, I'm sure there's a big story going on there, which, we haven't quite got the grip of yet. We don't understand the full implications of it. There's a lot of rumors going around that it's going to be a big, big deal. Not especially great news for Intel if that is the case, but man, I just want to see what's going on there. What is the game plan? There's so much going on that, PS5 Pro, that was hugely exciting when we learned about that news. And specifically, what we don't know about PlayStation 5 Pro. I mean, again, if we go back to PlayStation 4 Pro, we saw the specs. We saw exactly what we've seen recently with PS5 Pro developer documentation. But it's not until you actually see the demos and you hear from the platform holder itself that you get some grasp of what the plan is with this new piece of kit. So, yeah, you're quite right, very professional Dodo. There has been a lot of very negative discourse recently. And I'd say they're bad agents at play that are just trying to sow discord and make life miserable for everyone. But there's a huge amount of really positive stuff going on. And I'm sure it's going to play out as we go further into this year and result in some really interesting stuff. And that's kind of why I'm still in this game after so many years, because you never quite know what's around the corner. And when it does come, it's usually really, really exciting. So, yeah, plenty to look forward to, I'd say. So that is the last question, and therefore the end of the show. If you did enjoy it, please do like, subscribe, share. Store.digitalfoundry.net for all of our merchandising wares if you want to support the team on what we do and would like to wear apparel that has various Digital Foundry related stuff upon it, including this t-shirt, which is the DF approved t-shirt. Do check that out, store.digitalfoundry.net. DF supporter program. Contribute to this show, early access to this show each and every week, early access to various videos that aren't under embargo. Tons going on there too. But that's all from us for this week. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.